There's a specific kind of silence that a man carries when he has wired money to a dying woman's medical account and then discovered, 3 days later, that she was never sick. Not the woman, not the mother, not the cousin who called crying at 2 in the morning with the hospital name and the account number and the desperation in her voice that felt so real. He got out of bed in the dark and opened his laptop before he was even fully awake. None of it. Thomas Kowalczyk lost 51 hours to a family, not a single con artist. A family. A coordinated, multi-generational operation run out of a small town in Antioquia where everybody knew. Everybody. And the American was the only one who didn't understand what was happening to him. He lost that money over the course of 14 months. He was never robbed in any moment he could point to as the crime. He handed the money over, every dollar, in installments that each seemed reasonable at the time, to a woman he loved and people he had met and eaten with and trusted. If this could happen to Thomas Kowalczyk, a man with a 30-year career in industrial logistics, a man who had negotiated contracts worth 8 figures, a man who prided himself on reading people for a living, it could happen to almost anyone. While you're watching, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. And if stories like this one matter to you, a subscription costs you nothing and helps me keep telling them. My name is Thomas Gerald Kowalczyk, and I need to tell you about the year I learned that competence in one world means nothing in another. I spent 31 years moving freight. That is probably the least romantic way to describe a career, but it is the accurate one. I worked for a regional logistics company out of Akron, Ohio, starting as a dispatcher in 1989 when I was 24 years old and ending as their vice president of operations in 2019 when I was 54. The company handled industrial supply chains, manufacturing equipment, bulk chemical components, specialty steel, and by the time I left, I was overseeing roughly 340 employees across 4 distribution hubs in Ohio and Pennsylvania. I was good at it. I want to say that, not as a boast, but as context for what came later, because it matters that I was someone who had spent his entire adult life being competent, being the person in the room who identified problems before they happened. Being the one who read a contract and found the clause that would cost you money in month 18. I was that person professionally. I believed I was that person in all areas of my life. I made a good salary by Ohio standards. At my peak, I was earning $214,000 a year with bonuses, plus a profit-sharing arrangement that paid out well in the years the company performed. I had a house in Fairlawn, 4 bedrooms, paid off by 2015, a 401 that had crossed $880,000, and a brokerage account I managed myself that sat around $340,000. I drove a 5-year-old Chevy Tahoe and wore the same 3 work blazers for 6 years. I did not spend money on myself. I saved. That was what I knew how to do. I had been married once. Her name was Patricia. We got married in 1994 when we were both 29, and we had 2 children. My son Derek, who is now 31 and lives in Columbus, and my daughter Renee, who is 28 and lives in Pittsburgh with her husband. Patricia and I were not a bad couple in the way that makes for a dramatic story. We were a bad couple in the quieter, more corrosive way. She worked as an RN at Summa Health and worked long shifts, and I worked long hours. And somewhere in the years between the kids being young and the kids leaving for college, we had become 2 people who shared a house and a bank account, and almost nothing else. She told me once, during one of the few conversations we had that were actually honest, that living with me was like living with someone who was always slightly elsewhere. Not unkind, she said, just not present. I didn't disagree with her. I didn't know how to be otherwise. We separated in 2016 and finalized the divorce in 2017. It was civil. Patricia kept the house. We'd already paid it off, and it felt like the right thing. And I bought a smaller place in Cuyahoga Falls. Derek was 23 and already out. Renee was 21 and finishing school at Ohio State. Neither of them fell apart over the divorce the way some kids do. That was either a credit to us or an indictment of how checked out we'd all been. I've gone back and forth on that. What I can tell you is that between 2017 and 2020, I was functionally alone in a way I had not anticipated. I was 52, then 53, then 54, and the house in Cuyahoga Falls was a 2-bedroom place that I rattled around in. I had work friends, but work friends have a half-life. When you retire or leave a company, most of them drift. I had a few college acquaintances I'd see a couple of times a year, but no one I'd call in a bad moment. I retired from the company in February of 2020. 2 weeks before the world shut down. The timing was, there is no other word for it, catastrophic emotionally. I had built my entire identity around being necessary, around having a room full of problems waiting for me every morning. I retired on a Friday, and by the following Monday the pandemic hit, and my daughter's wedding, which had been planned for May, was postponed indefinitely, and I sat in my house in Cuyahoga Falls for the next 4 months watching the news. I did not handle it well. I am not going to dress that up. I drank more than I should have. I got into a routine of staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning watching YouTube, which is how I first encountered the channels about living abroad, the geographic arbitrage people, the digital nomad types who had retired to Medellin or Mexico City and were making videos about their $800 apartments and their rooftop pools and the quality of the avocados. I watched them with the combination of skepticism and hunger that I think a lot of men my age watched them with at that moment. Skepticism because it seemed too easy, too good, too curated. Hunger because I had nothing else to do. I want to be honest about what I was looking for. It was not purely financial. It was not even primarily financial. My retirement was secure. I was not going to Colombia for the cost of living, not really. I was going because the idea of a life that was still happening, a life with surprise in it, with unfamiliar streets and different languages, and the possibility of meeting people who did not already know my whole story. That idea had gotten inside me during those dark months in a way that rational arguments could not displace. I told myself it was research. I would go for 3 months, evaluate, come back with a clear head. That was what I told my son Derek when he raised an eyebrow. I told my daughter Renee I was treating myself to a delayed retirement gift. I told myself I was not lonely. I booked a one-way ticket to Jose Maria Cordova in October of 2021 on the back end of the first full pandemic year when international travel had reopened and Colombia had been running a vaccinated visitor program. I had a suitcase and a laptop and $1.2 million in accessible assets and a Spanish vocabulary of roughly 40 words. I did not realize, standing at the check-in counter at Cleveland Hopkins, that all 3 of those last facts had already been assessed by people I had not yet met. My first 2 weeks in Medellin were almost exactly what the YouTube channels had promised, which should have made me more suspicious than it did. I had rented a furnished apartment in El Poblado, a 2-bedroom in a building on Avenida El Poblado, which put me inside walking distance of Park Laris and the restaurants along Provenza and the coffee shops that had reliable Wi-Fi and English language menus posted in the window for people like me. I paid $100 a month for it. By Akron standards, it was a reasonable deal. By Medellin standards, I was paying foreigner rates, which I didn't yet understand was a category. The city disoriented me in ways I had not predicted. I had expected the poverty. I had read enough to know that Medellin's recent transformation was genuine but incomplete, that the cable cars running up to the comunas told the story of a city still working through enormous inequality. What I had not expected was the beauty of the place. The way the mountains came right down into the city on both sides. The perpetual 72 degrees, the density of the flowers. I walked for hours those first days, not trying to get anywhere, just letting the city move around me. It was the first time in years I felt like a person with time rather than a person running out of it. I found the expat community faster than I expect, which I now understand is by design. The infrastructure for bringing newly arrived Americans into social circles moves quickly because those circles have an interest in expanding. Within 4 days, I had met 2 other retired American men at a coffee shop in Provenza. Within 10 days, I had been invited to a weekly dinner that someone had been hosting for expats on Thursday nights in a rented private dining room above a restaurant on Calle 10. The man who introduced me to those Thursdays was named Gary Whitfield. He was 61, from Nashville, had sold a chain of auto parts stores, and had been living in Medellin for almost 3 years. He was tan and loud and enthusiastic in that way that men who have found something good are enthusiastic, missionary-like, wanting everyone to have what he had found. He had an apartment in Laureles and a girlfriend 30 years younger than named Paula, who he showed me photos of immediately and spoke about as though she were a trophy he had not yet fully confirmed was his. I found Gary exhausting, but I was grateful for him. He knew where things were. He knew which neighborhoods were safe at which hours. He knew how to talk to the taxi drivers and which restaurants wouldn't charge you triple for being obviously foreign. He was useful in the way that early local knowledge is useful, and I leaned on him more than I should have, given that I later realized Gary was also, like me, significantly more clueless than he thought he was. It was at the Thursday dinner, the sixth one I attended, which would have been late November 2021, that I met Alejandra. I want to be careful here, because it would be dishonest to flatten what she was into something simple. She was not a woman who appeared at a bar and approached the richest-looking foreigner. She was introduced to me by a woman named Cecilia Barragan, who worked in real estate development and who had been attending those dinners for over a year. Cecilia was 48, professional, serious. Not the kind of person who seemed like an entry point for anything predatory. She introduced Alejandra as her colleague, as someone who had just joined the architectural firm where Cecilia's husband worked as an investor. Alejandra Rios Montoya was 37 years old. She was from Fredonia, a small municipality about an hour and a half southwest of Medellin in the coffee-growing region of Antioquia. She had a degree in architecture from Universidad Nacional in Medellin. She had her own apartment in Envigado. She had a car, a used but clean Renault Duster, and she drove herself. She dressed in a way that was put together but not flashy. When Cecilia introduced her that night, she shook my hand without extended eye contact and went to get a drink and spent the first 40 minutes of the dinner talking to other people. That, I think, was the first assessment. The withdrawal. The deliberate withholding of attention from the obvious target. I noticed it. I noticed that I noticed it. I told myself I was being paranoid. We ended up seated near each other later in the evening, and she asked me about logistics. She was genuinely curious, it seemed, about how supply chains worked, how you manage the movement of physical objects across large distances without losing them. She had an engineer's mind. She asked specific questions. She pushed back on one thing I said about just-in-time inventory, with a point about the difference between redundancy and inefficiency that was actually correct and that I acknowledged was correct. I drove home that night thinking about the conversation. Not about her appearance, not about the age difference, but about the argument about supply chain redundancy. I did not realize until much later that the specificity of her interest, the targeted professional quality of her engagement, was a technique so refined it had become second nature. We exchanged numbers that night through Cecilia, formally, the way you would with a professional contact. She texted me 3 days later with an article about logistics automation in Latin America, and a note that said she had thought I might find it interesting. She was right, I did. We met for coffee once, then for lunch. Then she took me to a neighborhood in Laurels. She said tourists never found, and showed me a bakery that had been there since the 1960s, and ordered for both of us, without asking, and somehow got it right. She paid for that lunch. I offered, and she waved it off firmly and paid, and I registered that. I told myself it was a good sign. Over the following 6 weeks, we spent perhaps a dozen evenings together. She showed me Envigado on a Saturday, took me through the Central Park, explained the local politics of the municipio, introduced me to her neighbor, an older woman named Doña Carmen, who grew herbs on her balcony and pressed a small bunch of cilantro into my hands with the grave ceremony of a diplomat. Alejandra laughed at this. It was an unguarded laugh, and it did something to me. She was also, in ways I cataloged without fully processing, measuring me. The questions she asked, which I experienced as interest, were systematic in a way I only understood retrospectively. How long did I plan to stay in Colombia? Did I own property in the United States, or had I sold? Did my retirement funds remain in American accounts, or had I begun moving money to local banks? Was I in contact with a Colombian financial advisor, or did I manage my own investments? Did I have family who visited, or was I mostly on my own here? I answered all of it. I answered, honestly, because she had given me no reason not to, and because I was a man who had spent 30 years believing that honest information exchange was the foundation of functional relationships. By the end of November 2021, we were, in the way that middle-aged people enter into things gradually and then suddenly, in a relationship. She stayed at my apartment for the first time on a Friday evening in the first week of December. She was affectionate and private and did not once, in any of those early weeks, ask me for anything. That, I would learn, was the investment phase. She was buying my trust with her restraint. There was one thing that registered as different in those early months. When she spoke about her family, her mother, Rosario, her younger brother Edelson, her aunts and cousins still in Fredonia, she spoke about them as a unit, as a collective. "We are going to my family's property this weekend," she would say, not "I am visiting my mother." The "we" was always large. The family in her speech was not a set of individuals but a single organism with a shared set of concerns. I noticed this. I told myself it was a cultural difference. I told myself that Colombian families were simply closer than what I was used to in Ohio. Both of those things were true. They were also covered. In January of 2022, 2 months after we met, she said she wanted me to meet her family. She said it simply, the way you say something that is already decided. She did not phrase it as a question. I said yes. We drove out to Fredonia on a Saturday morning in her Renault Duster, up through the coffee fincas of western Antioquia, the road winding through green mountains in a way that made Medellin feel like it belonged to a different country. She drove confidently, knew every curve. She had grown up on these roads. The family home was a finca on the edge of town, not large but solid, well-maintained, with a garden that had clearly been tended for decades. There were fruit trees. There was a covered porch with plastic chairs and a table and a view down toward the valley. It was objectively beautiful. There were 11 people there that day. Rosario, her mother, a compact, watchful woman in her early 60s who hugged Alejandra for a long time and studied me with the attentiveness of someone evaluating something that had been brought into her house. Her brother Edelson, 29, who worked for the municipio in some administrative capacity that was never precisely defined. 2 aunts, 3 cousins ranging in age from teenagers to early 30s. A cousin's husband named Hector, who poured the aguardiente and laughed very loudly at things that were not that funny. An elderly woman introduced only as Abuela Inés who sat in a specific chair and received everyone in turn. They fed me for 4 hours. They spoke in a rapid Antioqueño Spanish that I could follow at roughly 40% comprehension, and Alejandra translated the important things and let the rest go, which I took as normal and which I now understand was selective. There were things said in that room that she chose not to translate. I felt welcomed. I felt like a man being brought home. It was an extraordinarily effective feeling. Driving back to Medellin that evening, Alejandra rested her hand on my leg and said simply that her mother liked me. I believed her. I was happy. I did not understand that I had just been introduced to my creditors. The first ask came in February of 2022, 4 months after we met. It came from Alejandra, not from the family, and it was framed with an apologetic precision that I think about often now. Her brother Edelson, she explained, had an opportunity. There was a position opening in the Medellin municipal government, a contracts administrator role, that would be a significant step up from what he was doing in Fredonia. But the application required a professional certification that cost a fee, and then there were preparation courses, and the combined cost was 3.8 million pesetas, which she mentioned almost offhandedly and then immediately translated for me. About $950. She said she would pay it herself, normally, but she had a cash flow problem that month because of a project delay at the firm. She was embarrassed to ask. She had not asked me for money in 4 months. She had occasionally paid for things herself. She had shown me, repeatedly, that she was a woman with her own income and her own life. $950. I gave it to her that evening as a bank transfer. She thanked me without excessive gratitude, which I noted. Too much gratitude would have felt like theater. The modulated appreciation felt real. It felt like accepting help from someone who genuinely didn't want to need it. Edelson, she reported 2 weeks later, had submitted the application. They were waiting to hear. 3 weeks after that, the first medical emergency. This one was Rosario, Alejandra's mother. She had been experiencing abdominal pain for weeks, as Alejandra told me, but had not wanted to say anything because she didn't want to worry anyone. And now the doctor had ordered a scan, and there was something on the scan that required a specialist at a private clinic in Medellin because the public system had a wait of 4 months and the specialist believed it could be serious. The total between the specialist consultation and the initial tests was 8.2 million pesos, about $2,050. I paid it. I said I was glad to. I met Rosario's eyes in my memory of her, that watchful, evaluating gaze, and I thought of her as a real person with a real illness who had welcomed me into her home. Looking back now, I can see what was already true. Every element of that first medical ask had been tuned to my specific psychology. It was not a large amount. It was for a parent, not for the girlfriend herself, less transactional. It came through Alejandra with reluctance, not as an aggressive request. And the alternative, the 4-month public system wait, was designed to create urgency without appearing manufactured. I was not a naive man. I was a man whose defenses had been systematically identified and circumvented. The scan results, Alejandra reported the following week, showed a benign cyst that would require monitoring but not surgery. Rosario was relieved. The family was relieved. I was told, through Alejandra, that Rosario had said a prayer of thanks and included my name in it. I felt good about this. I felt like a man who had done something useful. I did not know that the medical emergency I had just financed had been run, with slight variations, on at least 2 other foreign men in the preceding 4 years. I did not know this because I had no way of knowing it and no reason to go looking. The apparatus that surrounded me had been built over years to prevent exactly the kind of verification that would have saved me. By March of 2022, I had given Alejandra $3,000. In the architecture of what would eventually happen to me, that $3,000 was not money lost. That $3,000 was tuition, payment into a credibility account that would be drawn on heavily in the months that followed. The relationship itself in that period was genuinely good. I want to say this because it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Alejandra was a real person in my life. She was thoughtful and physically present and capable of the kind of attentiveness that I had not experienced in a long time. Not since the early years with Patricia, and even then it had not been quite like this. She remembered things I said. She asked follow-up questions weeks after I mentioned something in passing. She cooked for me on Sunday evenings with a thoroughness that felt like care. Arroz con pollo, bandeja paisa when she was in a particular mood. Once an elaborate sancocho that took most of the afternoon, and that she claimed was her grandmother's recipe. I was aware, in the back of my mind, that the age difference was a fact I should think harder about. That a 37-year-old woman of her professional caliber and apparent warmth being drawn to a 61-year-old retired American was a thing that warranted honest examination. I examined it. I arrived at the conclusion I was already primed to arrive at. I told myself I was not the first man to be loved by a younger woman. I told myself it was not impossible. Both of those things were technically true. The first one didn't matter here. The second one was doing a lot of heavy lifting for a very thin thread. The escalation from small medical emergencies to the architecture of something larger did not happen in a dramatic turn. It happened the way careers advance and marriages deteriorate. Gradually, then not gradually at all. But by the time you notice the acceleration, you are already moving faster than you can stop. By April of 2022, I had upgraded my apartment. Alejandra had, over several weeks, made quiet observations about the El Poblado building, the noise from Park Laris on weekends, the age of the appliances, the light in the afternoon. She never said we should move. She said once that Envigado had become very livable for foreigners, that there was a building near her that had units available, that the management was known to be reliable. She said this and did not mention it again. I found the building. I toured it. I upgraded to a unit at $1,650 a month, 45% more than I had been paying. Alejandra did not suggest I do this. I did it. She was pleased. The pleased expression on a woman who is genuinely pleased and on a woman who has successfully placed a piece on a board are indistinguishable to a man who does not know he is playing. The new apartment was nicer. She was there more often. Her things began to accumulate in small ways. A jacket in the closet, a second phone charger on the nightstand. We were, functionally, cohabitating in one direction while she maintained the fiction of her own apartment as evidence of her independence. Edelson had received his certification and obtained the Medellin job. He visited us at the new apartment once in April, and I shook his hand and felt good about the $950 I had spent on his future. He was pleasant and deferential and thanked me in a way that had been clearly rehearsed for the degree of warmth and the length. Not too much, not dismissive. I liked him, I was supposed to. In May, Rosario's monitoring scan showed that the cyst had grown. The specialist recommended a procedure, not surgery. He was careful to clarify through Alejandra, more of an interventional radiology procedure. Very safe, very targeted, but not covered by the Seguro because it was categorized as elective. The total cost at the private clinic was 22 million pesos, about $500. I paid it. I paid it without the pause that I should have had, because by May of 2022 I had established a behavioral pattern with these requests. I had answered them. The pattern had its own gravity. Saying no to the fifth ask, when I had said yes to the first four, required manufacturing a resistance that felt arbitrary even to me. I am a logistics man. I understand systems. When I look back at the structure of those requests now, what I see is an extraordinarily well-designed escalation model. Each ask was calibrated to be approximately double the previous one, but never more than double. Never a number that would produce a refusal response from a man of my specific financial profile. The intervals between asks were long enough to allow for a recovery period, for my comfort level to reset, for the gratitude cycle to complete. The requests always came through Alejandra, not directly from family members, which meant I never felt like I was being approached. I felt like I was choosing to help. There was one evening in June where something almost cracked. Alejandra had gone to Fredonia for a weekend to visit Rosario after the procedure, and I had stayed in Medellin because I had a video call scheduled with Derek on Saturday. While she was gone, I was sitting with my laptop on a Sunday afternoon, and I ran the numbers. I laid out every transfer I had made over 7 months. The total at that point was $9,750. I sat with that number for a while. And then I did the thing that I have spent a long time since being honest about. I reframed it. I told myself that $9,750 over 7 months for a woman who added the quality to my life that she added was not a large sum. I told myself that Patricia and I had easily spent $20,000 a year on a marriage that had eventually added nothing. I told myself that generosity in a relationship was not stupidity. I closed the laptop and called Alejandra and asked how Rosario was doing. That was the moment. That Sunday afternoon in June, that was the moment I had the information I needed and chose to interpret it the way I needed it to mean. Every dollar I lost after that had its root in that afternoon. What I did not yet know, sitting in that apartment in Envigado with the mountains visible through the window and the evening air coming from the valley below, was that 6 weeks later I would be introduced at a dinner in a finca outside Sabaneta to a man named Hernan Diaz Castaño, Alejandra's uncle by her mother's first marriage, 20 years older than her, a man with a silver watch and a quiet manner and a very specific idea about the next phase of what was going to happen to me. But that is where the first part of this story ends. The second part is where the real money started moving. Hernan Diaz Castaño arrived at the finca dinner outside Sabanet on a Thursday evening in late July of 2022 in a white Mazda CX-5 that was 3 years old and clean without being conspicuous. That detail registered with me later, the way a lot of details registered with me later. In the rear view, when the significance had already expired. The dinner was hosted by a man named Fernando, a Colombian architect who worked with Alejandra's firm on commercial projects, and who owned a small finca in the hills above Sabaneta that he used on weekends. There were 8 of us around a long table on the covered terrace. Fernando and his wife, 2 other Colombian couples I had met once or twice before, Alejandra and Hernan. I was the only foreigner. Hernan was 63 years old. He had the bearing of a man who had spent his life being taken seriously, not loud, not performing, just occupying space as though the space naturally organized itself around him. His Spanish was measured. He listened more than he talked. When he did talk, the table oriented toward him. He was introduced to me as Alejandra's uncle on her mother's side, though the relationship was more distant than that. Rosario's first husband's younger brother, which made him something like a step-uncle by a marriage that had ended 20 years earlier. He still had a relationship with the family. He still came to Fredonia for holidays. He had, Alejandra said, been a kind of second father to Edelson when they were young. That evening, over grilled trout and aguardiente and a view of the city lights below, Hernan asked me, with what seemed like genuine curiosity, about logistics, about supply chains, about how I thought about risk management in complex systems. He had a quality that I recognize now as a close cousin of Alejandra's early technique, the targeted engagement, the intelligent questions, the appearance of learn from you rather than assessing you. We talked for perhaps 90 minutes, ranging across topics. He had been involved, he told me, in agricultural land development, coffee finca acquisition and consolidation in western Antioquia, buying undervalued parcels from families who were exiting coffee farming and reselling them, sometimes improved, to developers and agrotourism operators. He described it matter-of-factly, not like a pitch. He mentioned that land values in certain parts of Antioquia had tripled in 6 years. He mentioned this once, and did not repeat it. Driving back to Envigado that night, Alejandra said her uncle had liked me. She said he was not a man who was effusive, and that the length of the conversation we had had was unusual for him. I was flattered. I was supposed to be. The second meeting with Hernan happened 3 weeks later, at a restaurant he suggested in Laureles, a quiet place on a side street near the stadium, the kind of place where business lunches happen and the tables have enough distance between them for conversations that are not meant to carry. He was already seated when I arrived. He had ordered sparkling water for both of us. He had a proposal he wanted to share with me. He prefaced it the way that proposals prefaced with phrase always are, with a declaration that he did not bring this to everyone, that he was bringing it to me specifically because of our conversation at Frando's dinner, because I had the kind of analytical mind that this type of opportunity required. He was not rushing anything. If I was not interested, there was no awkwardness. He would pay for lunch, and we would have a pleasant conversation about other things. The opportunity was land. A parcel of approximately 14 hectares in the municipality of Jardín, about 2 hours southwest of Medellín, in a section of Antioquia that had been seeing significant interest from boutique agro-tourism developers. The current owner was a family that had been farming coffee there for 3 generations and whose youngest son had emigrated to the United States and was not returning. The family wanted to sell in the next 60 days. The asking price was 480 million pesos, approximately $110,000. The parcel had been assessed by a firm Hernan, worked with 680 million pesos, and Hernan believed a resale to a developer contact he had in Bogotá could be arranged within 18 to 24 months at a price of 820 to 900 million pesos. At the midpoint of that range, my return would be approximately $77,000 on a $119 investment. In under 2 years, he slid a folder across the table. Inside was a property assessment, official letterhead, photographs of the land, topographic maps, a summary of comparable recent sales in Jardín municipality. It was thorough. It was the kind of documentation a careful man would produce. I took the folder home. I spent 3 days with it. I ran the numbers in multiple configurations. I did research on Jardín municipality that confirmed, independently, that it had been receiving significant agro-tourism development attention. I asked Hernan 2 follow-up questions by WhatsApp about the legal chain of title and the tax situation on the land. He answered both questions with documentation within 24 hours. I told myself I was being diligent. I was performing diligence. The difference matters. Real diligence would have involved hiring an independent Colombian attorney to review the title. Real diligence would have involved physically visiting the parcel with a surveyor who had no connection to Hernan or the family or anyone in that network. Real diligence would have verifying the assessment firm's credentials with the Colombian Professional Registry. I did none of those things. I reviewed the documents they gave me and called it diligence. I told Hernan I was interested. We met again in the same restaurant. He walked me through the transfer process. I would wire funds in 2 installments to a Colombian holding entity, Inversiones Díaz y Asociados S.A.S., which would handle the legal purchase and hold the title on my behalf until resale. The structure was explained as routine for foreign investors who could not hold Colombian rural property directly, which is a thing that sounds plausible enough if you do not know that the restriction is far more nuanced than that, and that direct foreign ownership of Colombian agricultural land is not in fact prohibited in the way he described. I wired $62,000 in the first week of September 2022. $62,000. I want you to understand that I did not feel this was a reckless act. I had $1.2 million in accessible assets at the point when I arrived in Colombia. I had spent 11 months building what I believed was a genuine life here, with a genuine relationship and connections to serious local people and a credentialed local partner in a sector I had researched. $62,000 felt like the kind of calculated risk that a serious person takes when they have done their homework. The second installment of $57,000 followed 3 weeks later, at Hernan's gentle reminder that the family's 60-day window was closing. $119,000 wired to Inversiones Díaz y Asociados S. Confirmed received. I received a countersigned copy of the holding agreement, which looked exactly like a real legal document, and which I later had reviewed by a Colombian attorney who told me it was paper. It referenced a corporate registration number that did not correspond to any active entity in the National Commercial Registry. That was October of 2022, 14 months into my time in Colombia. I did not know yet that the land investment had consumed almost everything, because the medical requests had not stopped. They had, if anything, found their rhythm. Between February and October of 2022, in addition to the land investment, I had paid the following: $900 for Edelson certification, $2 Rosario's first scan, $500 for Rosario procedure, $800 for a separate dental emergency for Rosario that had required a specialist in Medellin because, Alejandra explained, the pain had become severe and the public dentist in Fredonia had a 3-week wait, $3. $200 for a car repair for Edelson after his used Chevrolet Spark was involved in an accident on the road between Fredonia and Medellin. Not his fault, the other driver uninsured, and $200 for what Alejandra described as a legal situations involving the finca property title, a dispute with a neighboring family that required a lawyer in Rio Negro to file a preventative claim. None of those amounts had felt significant in isolation. They had all arrived spaced across 8 months, each with a reasonable story, each with a certain documentary texture, a hospital receipt here, a lawyer's letterhead there, a photograph of the damaged car. Together, before the land investment, they totaled $17,700. After the land investment, the total outflow from the moment I landed at Jose Maria Cordova was $136,700. I did not do that calculation until December of 2022, when I did it, sitting alone in the Envigado apartment on a Tuesday evening while Alejandra was in Fredonia for what she said was her mother's follow-up appointment. I sat with them for a long time, and I did not act on it. I told myself the land investment was an asset, not a loss. I told myself the medical expenses were the cost of being in a real relationship with real people who had real problems. I told myself that $130,700 against $1 million was 11%, which was not a figure that should alarm a man who had managed 8-figure contracts. What I did not tell myself, what I was not yet capable of telling myself, was that the relationship I was in had been designed from the first conversation to arrive at exactly the state it was in, that everything that felt like life was actually architecture. There was one evening in November where Alejandra said something that I filed away without understanding its full weight until much later. We were lying in bed after dinner and she said, quietly, as if thinking aloud rather than saying something to me directly, "My family worries about the future. They always have. In Fredonia, when something goes wrong, there is no safety net. You manage or you don't manage." I said I understood. I said I thought what she was building in Medellin was a different kind of life, more stable. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "They depend on what I can provide. That doesn't go away." I heard that as the confession of a responsible eldest daughter. I heard it as intimacy, the sharing of a burden. I reached over and held her hand in the dark. I was hearing the terms of an arrangement being articulated to me plainly, and I heard something else entirely. The call came at 2:14 in the morning on the 4th of March, 2023. I know the time because I checked my phone when it woke me, and the number was not Alejandra's. It was her cousin Juliana, a woman I had met twice, who lived in Fredonia and who had my number from a Christmas gathering I had attended at the finca. Juliana was crying. Her Spanish was fast and broken with distress, and I was half asleep and catching maybe one word in 3, but the words I caught were enough. Rosario, hospital, Medellin, serious, tonight. I called Alejandra immediately. She picked up on the second ring, which I did not find strange because I was not thinking about what time it was. She was already awake. Her voice had the particular quality of controlled fear that a person's voice has when they have been sitting with bad news for an hour, before someone else finds out. She said her mother had been rushed from Fredonia to a private clinic in Medellin, Clínica Las Américas, with what the doctor was describing as a hemorrhagic complication related to the cyst they had been monitoring. She said it was serious. She said she was on her way to Medellin, but the traffic on the road from Fredonia was terrible and she would not arrive for 2 hours. And then she said, "The clinic needs a deposit before they will begin the procedure. 15 million pesos. I don't have it tonight. I don't have access to it tonight. I need you to go. I need you to be there." 15 million pesos was approximately $50. I got out of bed in the dark. I opened my laptop. I transferred the money. I drove to Clínica Las Américas and sat in a waiting room for 3 hours. A nurse came out twice to update me in Spanish I mostly understood. I called Alejandra 4 times and she said she was almost there, and then she was there and she walked into that waiting room, looking exhausted and frightened, and she held on to me for a long time in a way that felt entirely real. Rosario was operated on that morning. The procedure took 4 hours. We sat in the waiting room together. She fell asleep against my shoulder at some point. The surgeon came out at 7 in the morning and said the procedure had gone well. I drove home at 8 that morning. I felt in the particular way of a man who has been useful in a crisis, quietly good about myself. Over the following 10 days, the billing arrived in pieces. The procedure, 38 million pesos. The anesthesiologist, separately billed, 6.2 million pesos. The ICU room for 4 nights, 11.8 million pesos. The medications and consumables, 4.4 million pesos. The follow-up specialist visit, 2.1 million pesos. A total of 62.5 million pesos, approximately 15,000. Less the initial deposit I had already paid, the balance Alejandra brought to me over 3 separate conversations across 10 days was $11,850. I paid it, all of it, without the kind of resistance that should have been there, because Rosario was real, because I had sat in that waiting room, because I had held Alejandra while she slept and felt the particular weight of someone who is genuinely afraid for a person they love. What I did not consider, what I was structurally prevented from considering by the architecture of the preceding 17 months, was that real clinics, real procedures, and real recoveries can be used as scaffolding for inflated billing, that the line item for the anesthesiologist separately billed in cash to an account number Alejandra provided was not the anesthesiologist, that the ICU nightly rate she quoted me was approximately double the actual rate at that clinic for the dates in question, which I confirmed months later when I paid a Colombian attorney to pull the records. Rosario had been sick, the procedure had been real, and the family had used that reality to collect an additional $11,850 on top of the actual costs. I have spent a long time sitting with that specific thing, with the fact that they did not invent the illness. They leveraged it. By April of 2023, my total outflow was approximately $148,000. The land investment had produced no communications from Hernan for 3 months, which I had attributed to the slow pace of Colombian property transactions. Alejandra's explanations when I raised it were consistent. Hernan's developer contact in Bogotá had delayed his decision, which was normal, which was how these things went, which was why Colombian land investments required patience and not the American compulsion for quarterly returns. I believed her, or I chose to act as though I believed her, which is not the same thing but produces the same outcomes. What broke it open was not the land investment. What broke it open was a phone. I had left my phone at the apartment one morning in May, a Tuesday, when I had gone for an early walk and had not taken it with me. Alejandra was still in the apartment when I left. When I returned, she was in the kitchen and her phone was on the counter, and the WhatsApp message that had just arrived was visible on the screen before it locked. She had not picked it up yet. The message was from a contact listed as Pipe. The message said in Spanish, "He still doesn't know? Keep it moving. The Jardine thing is closed." I stood in the kitchen doorway and read that message in the 3 seconds before the screen locked. She picked up her phone from the counter without looking at me. She glanced at the screen and then put it face down. I did not say anything. I walked to the living room. I sat down. I waited for the sound in my chest to resolve into something I could name. I went back to the kitchen and I said, very quietly, that I had seen the message. She looked at me, and what I saw in that look, what I had never seen before because it had never needed to be there before, was not panic, not shame, not the immediate crumbling of a woman caught in something she had not planned to be caught in. What I saw was a very fast, very clean recalibration. She was deciding in real time which story to tell. She said that Pipe was an old friend who sometimes helped her uncle with property transactions. She said she didn't know what the message meant. She said the tone of his message was just how he spoke. She was calm. She was almost perfectly calm. And that calmness, more than the message, more than any of the dollar amounts I had given her, was the thing that finally got through to me. I said, "Tell me about the land in Jardine." She said she would call Hernan. She said there was probably an update she had not received yet. I said, "Tell me what I bought." She said nothing for 10 seconds. And then she said, quietly, that the situation had become complicated, that there had been a problem with the title, that Hernan was working to resolve it. I said, "Is there land?" She looked at me. She said, "Theirs is a property. It's complicated." I understood, in that moment, with the particular clarity of a man who has been a logistics professional for 30 years and knows exactly what it means when the documentation doesn't match the reality, that there was no property. I understood, in that same moment, that I had known this for some time, and had been building a structure of alternative explanations to keep from knowing it. I asked her to leave the apartment. She left without a scene. She took her jacket and her phone charger and she left. At the door, she said, without turning around, that she was sorry things had become what they had become. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after the door closed. The week after Alejandra left the apartment, I hired a Colombian attorney named Luz Marina Ospina, whose name I found through an expat legal referral network, and I asked her to do three things. Verify the registration status of Inversiones Diaz y Asociadas S.A.S. Request the medical billing records from Clínica Las Américas for Rosario's March 2023 admission, and locate any property records in Jardín municipality connected to Hernan Diaz Castaño. The results came back over the following 2 weeks. Inversiones Diaz y Asociados S.A.S. had been registered with the Colombian Commercial Registry in 2019 and dissolved in 2021, 8 months before I wired money to it. The holding agreement I had signed referenced a registration number that had not corresponded to an active legal entity on the day I signed it. The Clínica Las Américas billing records showed that Rosario Rios had been admitted on the 4th of March and had undergone a laparoscopic procedure that had been covered in part by her contributory health insurance, which Alejandra had told me did not cover the procedure. The total billed to the insurance and to the patient directly, the actual total, was 31.2 million pesos, approximately $7,800. I had paid $15,006. The delta of $7,800 had gone to account numbers that the clinic had no record of. There was one parcel of land in Jardín municipality that had any connection to the Diaz family. It was 4 hectares, not 14, had been listed for sale in 2021 at 180 million pesos, and it had been sold in September 2022, the same month I wired my first installment, to a buyer whose identity Luz Marina could not confirm without a more expensive title search I could not afford at that point. The land had existed, 4 hectares of it. My $119,000 had purchased someone a 4-hectare parcel, and the excess had gone elsewhere, into a structure that was now dissolved and untraceable. I presented all of this to Luz Marina and asked her what I could do. She was honest with me. She said I could file a denuncia, a criminal complaint, with the Fiscalía. She said the probability of recovery of drawing any funds through that process was low, because the entities involved had been dissolved. The principals were distributed across a family network in a rural municipality where the investigative resources of the Fiscalía were stretched thin, and the holding agreement I had signed, while fraudulent in its company registration, had been signed by me voluntarily. She said that from a practical standpoint, the complaint was worth filing for the record, but that I should not expect it to return my money. She charged me $3,800 for 2 weeks of work and the report. I paid it and filed the denuncia. I then made the first of what I will call the recovery mistakes. Someone in the expat network, a man I had met twice at the Thursday dinners, whose name I will not use, told him about a firm that specialized in recovering funds from investment fraud in Latin America, based in Miami. He said a colleague of his had used them and recovered 60% of a significant loss. He said they were not cheap, but they were effective. I contacted them. A man named Robert, who spoke with the clean confidence of someone who knows exactly what you need to hear, told me that they had identified 6 active cases with Colombian land investment fraud, and that my case had significant recoverable elements. He told me the retainer was $14,200. He told me that in his experience, clients who engaged them within 90 days of discovery had substantially higher recovery rates than those who waited. I wired the $14,200 within the week. Robert sent me updates for 6 weeks. The updates were detailed, referenced specific legal proceedings, named Colombian legal partners, cited timeline benchmarks. At week 7, the updates stopped. At week 9, the Miami phone number rang to a full voicemail. At week 11, the website was gone. I had retained a recovery scam to recover money from an investment scam. The amount I had now lost climbed to $162,700. I want you to understand that I understood, at the moment I sent that second wire to Miami, that something was wrong with my judgment. I understood it clearly. I sent the wire anyway because the alternative, accepting the full scope of what had happened to me, was something I could not yet do. I stayed in the Envigado apartment through July of 2023 because I had paid through the end of the month and because I had nowhere immediate to go. I stopped going to the Thursday dinners. I stopped walking in the evenings. I ate at the apartment. I watched the ceiling. Gary Whitfield called me once during this period. He had heard through the network that something had gone wrong for me. Though he didn't know the details. He asked if I was okay. I said I was managing. He said if I needed anything to let him know. I thanked him and did not call him again. In the second week of July, I received a WhatsApp message from a number I did not recognize. The message said, in English, "We know you filed a complaint against Hernan Diaz. This will create problems for Alejandra. If you withdraw the complaint, the situation can be resolved. If you do not, we can provide information about your activities in Colombia to immigration authorities." It was a threat that was entirely empty. I had done nothing that would interest Colombian immigration authorities, but that did not stop it from landing with the full weight of a threat. I was alone in a foreign country. I had $46,000 remaining in accessible accounts, most of it in U.S. banks that I was drawing down on an ATM card. I did not know at that moment whether the threat had any legal teeth. I did not know whether they could do anything or whether they were simply testing to see if I would flinch. I did not withdraw the complaint, but I spent 3 days in a state of fear that I will describe only as the particular fear of a man who has made himself very alone in a place he does not fully understand. I moved out of the Envigado apartment at the end of July. I found a room in a shared apartment in Laurels. 3 Colombian university students and me, a 62-year-old American, in a 3-bedroom apartment that cost me $380 a month. The room was barely large enough for the single bed and the small desk. There was 1 bathroom for 4 people. The students were kind and bewildered by my presence, and we coexisted carefully, like people in a lifeboat who have agreed not to discuss how they got there. I was eating rice and eggs, not as a metaphor, literally. Rice and eggs and the occasional piece of chicken from the tienda 2 blocks away when I allowed myself the additional $1.40. I was watching my U.S. bank balance on my phone every morning the way I had once watched freight manifests. The way you watch something you know is going in the wrong direction, but that you cannot stop. I called my son Derek in August. I want to tell you about that call because it was the hardest single thing I did across the entire 14 months of this story, including the night I stood in the kitchen and confronted Alejandra, including the day I sat in Luz Marina's office and understood the scope of it. Those things were hard. This was harder. Derek picked up on the second ring. He is a calm man, calmer than I am, always has been. I told him I was in trouble. I told him I had made serious financial mistakes. I told him I was in Colombia with approximately $32,000 left in accessible accounts and that I owed Luz Marina another $2,000 and that I needed to come home but that I didn't have the confidence to say I could manage the transition without help. Derek was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Dad, tell me what you need." Not "I told you so." Not "How could you?" Just tell me what you need. I told him I needed a plane ticket. That was all I was willing to ask for. A ticket home. I told him I could handle the rest. He booked it that afternoon. He sent me the confirmation. A direct flight from Jose Maria Cordova to Atlanta, then Atlanta to Cleveland, departing August 24th. I sat on the edge of the single bed in the Laurel's room with the confirmation on my phone screen, and I did not cry. I want to be honest about that. I did not cry. I felt something that was too exhausted to be grief and too real to be numbness. I felt the weight of what I had handed over. Not just the money, but the version of myself I had taken to Colombia. The man who thought he had it figured out. The man who thought his competence in one world translated into all worlds. That man had not survived Colombia. I was not sure yet what had. I have been back in the United States for a little over a year now. I am living in Columbus, in a 2-bedroom apartment near Derek and his family. Renee and her husband drove up from Pittsburgh in September of last year, and we had dinner together, the 4 of us, and nobody asked me to account for anything. They simply made room for what I had become. That is a kind of grace I did not earn and did not expect and will not forget. I filed taxes last spring for the first time in my adult life with nothing to report as investments. I currently work part-time as a logistic consultant for a small firm that uses me on an hourly basis for contract analysis. I make approximately $58,000 a year. I have $211,000 left across all my accounts, the remnant of the retirement I had spent 31 years building. The full tally, I arrived in Colombia with $1.2 million in accessible assets. I returned with $243,000, from which I have since spent approximately $32,000 on the attorney, the transition, and establishing myself back in Ohio. The net loss from Colombia was $957,000. though the majority of that erosion came not from the fraud itself, but from what happened to my brokerage account 2022 and 2023, when I was making emotional decisions about my U.S. investments while my attention was entirely elsewhere. A loss I can attribute to Colombia without it being Colombia's fault. The money I was directly defrauded of, the land investment, the inflated medical billing, the Miami recovery firm totals $148,500. To that I could add, conservatively, $18,000 in gifts and transfers that were not extortionate but were not voluntary either. They were the cost of maintaining a relationship whose primary purpose was the extraction of larger sums, $166,000 and $500. That is what the Rios family of Fredonia, Antioquia took from Thomas Kowalczyk of Akron, Ohio, not all at once, over 14 months, in amounts that each individually a reasonable man could justify. I want to tell you what I understand now that I did not understand then, not as a warning, because I do not trust warnings. I heard a warning before I went to Colombia and applied it to someone less careful than me, but as the specific, ugly knowledge that can only be acquired by having done the thing. The first thing is this: loneliness is not a feeling, it is a structural vulnerability. It changes what evidence you are willing to accept and what evidence you are motivated to ignore. I was not lonely in the way that I would have described myself as lonely. I had a career, children I talked to, a functional life. But I was a 61-year-old man who had not been genuinely seen by another person in years, and when someone saw me, or performed seeing me, with sufficient skill, I extended to that performance a trust that had nothing to do with the evidence and everything to do with the need. The second thing is this: the family operation was not remarkable in its cruelty. It was remarkable in its patience. 14 months. That is not the work of con artists who are doing this casually. That is an infrastructure. And that infrastructure had at its center a woman who was capable of genuine feeling and genuine simultaneously. Not one or the other, both. And that combination is something that the framing of scam does not quite capture, because scam implies a clean separation between the performance and the person. What Alejandra did to me did not feel like a performance from the inside, because it was not entirely a performance. The warmth was real. The interest was real. The Sunday evenings were real. What was also real, running underneath all of it, was the accounting. The third thing, and this is the one I come back to most, in the quiet of the Columbus apartment, in the early mornings when I am not yet able to fully distract myself, is that my confidence was not a protection. It was the target. I was chosen not despite the fact that I was a man who believed he could read situations, but because of it. A man who believes he cannot be fooled is a man who has already lowered his most important defense. He has outsourced his vigilance to his self-image. And self-image, it turns out, is a very poor security system. I would go back and change the choice at the departures counter in Cleveland Hopkins if I could. But I would also need to go back further than that, to the silence in the house in Cuyahoga Falls, to the evenings of rice and YouTube, to the long, slow year of becoming someone who needed, so badly, for something to be beginning. I do not blame Colombia for what happened to me. I do not blame Colombians. I have met people in that country who showed me more decency than I deserved, including the students in Laurels, drawn who tolerated my presence in their apartment without complaint, including the woman at the Fiscalia intake desk who processed my denuncia with an attentiveness that suggested she had seen this before and that it still mattered to her. What I blame is the version of myself that I carried to Colombia. A man so armored in his own competence that he could be walked through a door he would have locked in any other room of his life. That man handed over $166,500 to a family he had eaten Sunday lunch with in the mountains of Antioquia, and the family kept it, and they are still there, and I am here, working on being a different kind of careful. There is something I want to say from outside this story before I let it go. The question I am asked most often, when I share accounts like Thomas's, is some version of, how does a man like that not see it coming? The answer is that he does see it. He sees almost all of it. He sees the age difference and explains it. He sees the money flowing outward and reframes it. He sits on a Sunday afternoon with the total in front of him and closes the laptop. The seeing is not the problem. The problem is what a man does with what he sees when what he sees is in conflict with what he needs to be true. That is not a Colombia problem. That is not a problem with Latin America or with younger women or with retirement or with any of the categories we want to use to contain this. It is a human problem. It happens to confident people in particular because confidence, when it is built on competence rather than on honest self-knowledge, has a blind spot at its center, is precisely the size and shape of the thing you most need not to see. If this story has stayed with you, please consider subscribing. It costs you nothing, and it helps me keep dedicating time to telling these accounts with the care they deserve. I'll see you in the next one.